Hi, I'm Dr. Marlo Payne Thurman. I'm here today with Carol Weinman, who is going to talk to us on the topic of autism and police encounters, which is such a relevant topic in this period of time we're living in. So we're so happy to have Carol. Hi, Carol. How are you today?
Hi, I'm doing pretty well, Marlo. How are you
Great.
doing?
I'm great. Carol is an attorney, an autism expert, an international speaker, a mediator, an author, and a parent. She's a former Philadelphia prosecutor and criminal defense attorney, internationally recognized for her unique dual expertise in criminal law and autism spectrum disorders. Ms. Wyman consults nationally on autism cases with lawyers, psychologists, educators, and families. She appeared weekly as a legal analyst for a CBS affiliated talk show focusing on autism and the law. Ms. Wyman speaks and conducts webinars and training. She has published articles on autism crime and is currently developing a school curriculum on this specific topic. So we're really excited to have you here today. I know, Carol, that you kind of approached us several months ago just because we were seeing this rise in cases. And I kind of maybe want to start with maybe you telling us what brought you to wanting to really talk about this. And I know it has to do with the cases, but maybe talk a little bit about what you're seeing right now and the concerns that brought this topic to the surface for you.
Well, there are more and more cases of individuals with autism that are having police encounters. Some are arrests, some may not turn into an arrest. But when I reached out to you, Marlo, it's because I was so compelled to have to talk on this, because I just keep seeing more and more, and these are only the ones that make the news. You know,
Right.
There's a lot more of I'm talking about the ones, but there were more hitting the news, so it's more in our face. I'm hit with it every day with phone calls from panicked parents and adult individuals who have been arrested or being investigated. So I reached out to you at a time when there were just a couple cases that I've just found sort of appalling. And it's not that I haven't seen this before, it's just that it keeps going on. And there has been so much more conversation around police training and around this awareness of that is necessary for police to have about people on the spectrum, so that when they encounter them, they are a little more sensitive to some of the issues that they would not know but for a training. And we are seeing more and more of them, and that's the other thing that's happening, is because they're getting older. The people with autism are getting older. So we're seeing a lot more of them now out in the world, out on the street, out in colleges, where they have more of an opportunity to be having an encounter with a police officer. So what I really wanted to do was touch on a couple of the recent cases to show what the trend a little bit has been, and then talk about some of that. There was a case that made the news recently. It had happened in February 2019, but it's back in the news because there's a pending lawsuit. And this was a case of a 32-year-old Black man with autism who was just happened to be walking home. And as is not that uncommon, the police officer, two of them were patrolling, and asked him, just said, "Could you please come over? We'd like to talk to you." And he said, "Well, I didn't do anything wrong." And the next thing you know, for anyone who understands autism, the sirens and the flashing lights, because of his sensitivity to sensory issues, made him very scared and upset. And so he took out his cell phone to call his mom. Now, this is a 32-year-old man calling his mom, okay? And with that, the police officer, whether they thought it was a weapon or just got nervous, his other hand was up in the air. They went and threw him against a wire fence and started tasing him. And he was screaming, "Please stop tasing me, please stop tasing me." Well, he was charged with jaywalking, being out in a park after dark, which I really don't know if I understand, and resisting arrest. Right. And those charges have all been dismissed. But I'm bringing it to the attention of the audience and out in the public eye, because we're seeing this scenario happen again and again. And so he happened to be 32 years old. And he had a double whammy because, Black and with autism, it has its own set of issues in terms of being stopped. There was a case of a case where there was a Black man who Elijah McClain. Was a big case, if you know the name. He was killed by the police, and there was a big stink about the fact that he was a Black man with a ski mask. That's why, and they thought he looked sort of sketchy, and he had a ski mask on because it kept him warm, particularly warm, because he had issues with being anemic, and so he needed it to keep him warm. And so it made him look sketchy, and he was just walking home at night. So we're seeing more and more of this. Another case, now these were adults. What I've been really, really disturbed about is that a lot of the other cases I wanted to point out are children that are teens and younger. So there was a case in Salt Lake, Utah, of a 13-year-old back in September, more recently, September of this past year. And the mother called, and this is also very common, Marlo. The mother called because her son was having a meltdown, a mental breakdown, and she wanted him to be transported to a hospital for treatment. So she called, really wanting a crisis intervention team. And when the police arrived, she told them what she felt they needed to know in terms of how to approach her son. And the next thing she knows, they're tackling him down to the floor, and she hears shots. She thinks he's dead. And she's screaming at the police. He's unarmed, he just screams and gets out of control because he doesn't know how to regulate.
Right.
And that, I want to put an emphasis on that because that is at the core of a lot of these cases. They're not knowing how to regulate. And I'll get into that a little bit later, possibly, but it's about, the whole issue of de-escalation and the need for more real in-depth understanding of what that takes. So what happened in this case, and in a lot of the cases, is that the police are called in more to be a crisis intervention team, but that's not what happens. It then escalates. And we've seen this also with mental illness, the guy who had the hood put over him in the street. I'm sure everybody remembers that. He was naked. And so it also applies to other mentally ill or other neurodiverse issues. I happen to be talking on autism, but there was another case where the officers are not being trained in crisis intervention, which has been an issue with the mental illness for a long time. Another case that fast forward to October of 2020 took place in Baltimore. And this was a kid that was 11 years old. And he was in a middle school, he was being bullied. So he went and hit a kid, and they moved him to what they call a focus room. And he's in the focus room, and the resource officer, this made the news big time, resource officer, this was one of the ones that really got to me, went and handcuffed him for 23 minutes. And the kid kept screaming that his hands were hurting, his wrists. And it ends up that he had a broken wrist from being handcuffed. And again, it was that he was resisting the officer because that's what people with autism do for many reasons. And then, as I've spoken about before, they're slapped with resisting arrest almost every time. So then we go to another case that took place in North Carolina. And this was a 7-year-old at the time. The case came back around because it's in the news again for, pending lawsuits, but it took place in 2018. And this was a boy who was 7 at the time. They put him also in one of the quiet rooms. This is, again, a resource officer. So these are two cases that took place in a school, which is a whole separate issue and a very disturbing one, I think. And not all schools have resource officers in them, but they have them for safety reasons, which I understand. But they're getting involved in a lot of these cases with the kids with autism, and then they're ending up down at the police roundhouse or the district or whatever. And this was a case again of a resource officer, like the last one. He went by the quiet room and he saw the kid spit on the floor, allegedly. And so he says, I'll take it from here. And he starts threatening this 7-year-old that I'm going to arrest you for a crime of spitting. I mean, you know, it sounds really crazy to me. And then forced the child to kneel on the floor and threatened that he was going to put a spit hold on him. And that's still, this case is still under investigation as far as I know.
Right.
Fast forward to January of this year, and this was really hard to listen to. There's a videotape that was played publicly on newscasts of a 9-year-old girl whose mother also called with family trouble. Kid was, you know, having some kind of a breakdown, I guess, and there was a problem. And when the police got to the house, they wanted to take the kid to a hospital, and she refused to get in the car, and she refused to follow commands to get in the car. And they kept saying, you got to get in the police vehicle. So they put her in the police vehicle, and she's thrashing. I mean, this is on video, just thrashing around the entire car. And they started saying to her, if you don't stop, we're going to spray pepper spray in your eyeballs. I mean, you're talking about a 9-year-old.
Yeah.
So that's what they proceeded to do. And you see it on tape, and she's screaming. So those are the most recent cases that have made the press, that have made media or the newscast. I do get a lot of calls about kids getting in trouble in school. I am actually still surprised at how many of those I get. And a lot of them just should not have escalated to where they got to.
Right.
They really shouldn't have. And I think that this is something we just really need to do better. We really need to get better at. And I believe that the officers, the resource officers in school are not being trained to deal with this properly. And even more so, Marlo, I think that they should have crisis intervention teams being trained. Right. There is some talk about putting the resources, the financial resources into that training, not police officers. You know, that's really not what they are here for, in my opinion. They really need to get people who know how to deal in crisis and can be trained in crisis intervention. And I think that that's where we need to go in the schools. We need to have special education people, or people that are trained in this area, to be dealing with these kids, because once again, when you understand it better and you know what you're looking at, I think that there's a lot of room for, and we need more empathy, more compassion, and a real better understanding of what's happening, because it is so distorted and so misinterpreted. And then what happens is it all escalates, and it just gets completely out of control when it doesn't have to.
Right. And that, you know, you talked about that we've got more security offers, and obviously that's because of, you know, our school shootings and things. In other words, people who don't have the mental health training, that are in these situations to have to deal with mental health and autism in particular in this particular situation. But are there other things that you think are happening right now in our society that are affecting the rising cases? Or are you feeling like it's not really a rising cases, that we're just more aware of them?
Well, no, I think one of the reasons there's a rise in cases is, as I said earlier, because they're aging up.
Gotcha. So that bubble, okay, where
we have a lot more people that have autism that are now going out into the public eye. You know, when they were at home as little kids, we wouldn't be dealing with this. But right, now they're getting to be teenagers, and then they're going to be college age. And then the other reason we're, quote, seeing more is because then you have adults that have now been diagnosed, right, that are having encounters with the police, and they might have been having them before, but we didn't know that they were on the spectrum.
So the increase in the bubble, in other words, and by the way, for our viewers, we know that autism has increased, you know, in the last 25 years from 1 in about 5,000 to 1 in about 59 is our current CDC numbers. And so what you're really talking about is that increase has now aged. Those kids are getting to be adults. And so we're seeing that huge increase of autism. Those kids are growing up.
There's just a lot more of them out there.
Right,
Marlo.
exactly.
I mean, quite honestly, there's a lot more of them out in the world.
Yeah,
And,
yeah.
and so the chances that they're going to have an encounter with a police officer, is much greater. The Drexel Autism Institute in 2017 did a study that showed that the increased proportion of people with autism under 21 who are now, having contact with the police, and 5% of those are getting arrested. Now that was back in 2017, but.
And do you think that's because people don't understand what autism is or what autism looks like? In other words, obviously there's more of them by numbers alone.
Yeah.
What are the
I think it's both. I think it's both of what you said. I think they have a misconception possibly about what autism is, but I think the greatest reason we're having these problems is because, like you said, secondly, they don't know what it looks like. Okay. You have a 32-year-old calling his mother. Okay. If you know anything about autism, that would have been a red flag right there. That might have been a red flag to you, that a 32-year-old doesn't necessarily pick up the phone and call his mom when he's scared or upset. But someone with autism does, because a 32-year-old with autism really is more like a teenager. Okay. Right. That's their emotional and psychological development is more like a teenager. And it's a lot to bite off, to expect police officers to be able to know it to this degree. But I think that we do have to train them to know what they're looking for, to know better what they're looking for. I don't know if they're going to be able to know everything, because I think that would take an intensiveness that I don't know if it's really plausible, and it would take a lot of years. But they need to know more than they know now. I'm seeing these trainings going, and I've spoken on this before. There's trainings going on all over the country now, police trainings, and I'm glad that there are. I mean, that's a wonderful thing, and some of them are mandated. But they're just too superficial to really do what we need them to accomplish, to achieve. To just say, when you see a kid with autism, talk calmly to them. When you see a kid with autism, talk softly. That's better than not, as I've said before, but we need to do better. We need them to understand more in depth what they're looking at, what they're dealing with, and even more importantly, why this person, and then oftentimes the child, is even doing this. Let's look at what the behavior is telling us, because that's what it is. It's behavior. It's not what officers are interpreting as a bad, an ill-intended mindset. It's not that. It's a behavior manifestation of something else that's going on.
Well, and we know that so many times in autism that individuals speak through their behavior because they don't have the capacity in those moments to put their language system in place. So they really are trying to say something, trying to interact, trying to solve a problem, and the behavior ends up where it spills over into. So we know that's true. So you kind of mentioned a few minutes ago, and I think it's really important, this kind of idea of introducing mental health and crisis workers into the police force. In other words, don't expect the police officers to do everything.
Right.
Talk a little bit about that, and also other kinds of things that you think would be helpful to kind of put a stop to these kinds of incidences.
Well, I don't want to, I'm always reluctant, and nor is my intent, to point fingers always at at law enforcement.
Exactly, because they really have a hard job already.
Exactly. It's sort of how I felt about teachers before they were trained to be for all this IEP special education stuff. I felt really bad for teachers because they ran over their head, and it wasn't their fault. It's not officers' faults either. They're doing the best they can, I think, with the training that they have, or with the knowledge that they have. And I think that given the opportunity, they would want to do better. I mean, that's what I've always learned. So I want to make it clear that I've never been one to want to point a finger at a police officer that way and lay blame. But the facts are there that is why a lot of this is happening. It's just a fact that that the police officer is in over his or her head and doesn't know what to do in a given situation. They don't even know what they're in. And there are safety concerns. They have a very dangerous job. If they understood better than when that kid was going for a cell phone, he wasn't reaching for a gun, they would respond differently. But what I was saying about crisis intervention is that's what we're talking about. We're talking about crisis intervention in a lot of these cases. And a lot of times parents are calling the police to come help them at home. And those are the cases where I think it's really tragic because they're escalating. And here the parent called because they wanted help, because they're in over their head, okay? They're scared. They have a child who's out of control. They either want them to have treatment or they're scared for their own safety. So they're calling up the police, okay? We don't want that to then become a double problem. They get there. And now we have a mother with a child in distress and in crisis. And now we pour on top of that a police officer who then now they're going to be hit with arrest. I mean, what needs to be also talked about is how devastating I thought that would be for a parent calling to get help. And then she has handed her child over to the police officer. I can't imagine, I wouldn't want to imagine how awful that must feel for a parent, that they invited that into their home unknowingly. And the impact also I wanted to touch on of these police encounters, the impact it has on the family, the PTSD effect it has on the person going through it. There are just there's so much fallout that I think we really need to save ourselves from. One of these cases, the kid wouldn't get out of the car anymore to go into a store with his mom because he was afraid he would get scared every time he even walked past a police officer after an event like this. So it's really doing the exact opposite of what we want. It's not going to foster this relationship with police officers. It's going to cause, more of a severance of a relationship, which is not what our goal is. So in terms of what needs to be done, to go back to your question, I do believe that we need to have a focus more, yes, on people that are trained in crisis intervention. Same way you would we've seen this problem with police officers too, with someone who's mentally ill. They're more trained. There are crisis intervention teams that are trained to know what to do when they get in a situation like that. And I think we need the same thing for people with autism. I think we need a crisis intervention team. I definitely think we need something in schools that's a lot more than what we're seeing. Law enforcement shouldn't be dealing with a kid that took a pair of scissors in a classroom, which is, this is another thing that, and took a pair of scissors, and then the police come in because they think he has they charge him with a deadly weapon, and it just snowballs from there. Though that's the lens they're also looking through. They're looking through a safety lens. They're looking through a law enforcement training lens. Someone in crisis intervention is going to have a different lens.
Right.
And that's why, yes, I think we have to go about this in a different way. I really think we have to look at this from a different perspective than always bringing law enforcement in and thinking that we're going to be able to train all of law enforcement to do this. I think that's a big nut to crack. I do. And I don't think that what we're seeing so far, we still need to have that training because they're going to run into them outside of school. But I think that the increase we're seeing with police encounters that are not going well and arrests is our evidence that it's not working. The training so far is just not, I don't think it's working. I think, maybe we would have even more than that without it. So I don't want to say it's not doing anything, but we really need to do more. So that's the best way I can answer that.
Yeah. And, one of the things we have, Ron Kaufman is doing some de-escalation training. That's basically a curriculum that's teaching parents how to help caregivers and their child kind of through a de-escalation process. And I think that's a really powerful tool also. And I think you would agree with that any kind of time we can train, whether it's a school personnel or police personnel, to work in a de-escalation model with individuals with autism, I think we've kind of made a little progress
Right.
forward.
The de-escalation training you're talking about is wonderful. And that's when I said a curriculum, I do want to mention that we have to do it from the side of the law enforcement. We also have to do it from the side of the individual. You know, we have to train them. And that's what my curriculum is about. That's where we dropped the ball and we haven't done enough. And there's a real need to be training them, not only how to interact with police officers, which is a big one, and that's being done in some places, not a lot, but more so how to prevent this from an early time. So we have two different things we're dealing with. We're dealing with the people that are already out there that didn't get what they needed, in my opinion, to prevent this from happening. And then we have the people with autism starting at a younger age to be able to do better coming up, so that we don't have these encounters with police officers, so that they know better from their end what they need to do and not do and understand. So it's all about understanding. It's really about education and knowledge. You know, knowledge is power. And the more we can understand this from both sides, the more successful we're going to be. But I mean, as I said, I want to make clear that the reason I wanted to come out and talk about this is because I'm really concerned of how much we're still seeing it. Okay, right. These instances I talked about, they just shouldn't be happening. They're not necessary. The toll that it's taking on the person, the child, the family, and in certain instances the schools, we have enough to do. We don't need to do it this way. There's a better way to do this. That's really why I needed to come out and speak on it. We all have to come together, whether it's law enforcement, the schools, the parents. This one's more about police encounters. I've talked about, the whole system, that we need more awareness, but that's another topic. We need to do more training. We need to do more education. We need to do more funding for people, to be in the schools that maybe they don't have enough support.
So let me ask you this, and I know this is kind of a curveball question for you, but I've heard you talk on this topic before, so I know you're ready. If parents are in a situation, can you give us some really specific tips of what you would advise a parent who is in a legal situation with their child? In other words, some of those really specific tips. And at what point do they need to call a lawyer? At what point do they, in other words, walk us through that process a tiny bit.
That's so interesting you're asking that, because I was just asked to speak on this topic a few years ago or several. That wouldn't have been the case because it wasn't happening as much. I'm saying it again goes to support the fact that it's happening more, because parents really are now asking for guidance. What do I do if my kid's arrested? Because some of them have already gone through it and they didn't know what to do. Of course, I'm coming at this being a criminal lawyer, but if you have your child have any contact with the police to the degree that they're taking them down to be questioned, even that arrest for sure, you better call a lawyer. Okay. I mean, my biggest word of caution is they shouldn't be saying anything. And that's not so simple when you're dealing with people with autism, because they love to talk a lot.
And they're honest.
And they love, right. And they love to tell the truth. And they want to tell their story. And it's a real hard issue for criminal attorneys, I'll tell you, because once that gets out of the box, you can't put it back in. And they really do give statements and whatever. And the other topic on this that is one that I'm very passionate about is that they shouldn't be questioned. They shouldn't even be questioned without a lawyer or an advocate, okay? They shouldn't even be in a room with a police officer, because more than a neurotypical defendant, they don't understand a lot of what's being said, Marlo. They're literal. They don't, and they love to please, so they'll say yes when they shouldn't have. And there's just so many issues about them being questioned even or interrogated without someone there. So my answer to what you're asking is, say less or nothing and get a lawyer. And most of all, it's hard when you're in the moment, because as a parent or a caregiver, you're going to be so flipped out if your kid is picked up. But the most important thing I think that parents or caregivers have to remember is not to feel coercion or pressure by the police to cooperate, to talk, to, they're masters at getting parents to cooperate because they think they're going to get a better outcome from that. And that is not the way the system works. Okay, the system does not work that way. I mean, maybe down the road, I'm not saying about cooperation once they have a lawyer, but not in terms at the front end of telling your story and sharing what's going on. That could be really detrimental to a case. So the first thing I would say is to get a lawyer ASAP.
Let's back up a tiny bit to that school or to that parent who has a really escalated and potentially dangerous kid, either that is assaulting the parents or is kind of threatening to assault other kids or out of control. What do you think are the better steps rather than just calling in the police? What are some of those other better steps? Do you have?
Well, that's another really good question, because a lot of the calls that I get are a result of a parent who called the police for those in those exact situations.
I get a lot of those too.
Yeah. And my first thought always is, oh, I just wish you hadn't called the police in. I wish you had taken them, gotten them to a inpatient treatment center or a hospital. But not the police. I can't speak to every state and every county and every city, but depending where you live, there are crisis intervention teams and crisis lines you can call. There are teams that can go.
Crisis line over a police department is usually a better bet. Is what you're.
That's right. That's really the big important takeaway is that you really should call a crisis center or a mental health professional or someone like that to see what to do, rather than using the police officers for that purpose. I think that's really what I'm trying to say.
That's a good tip. That's a really good tip.
Yeah, because once you're wrapped up in that system, it's hard to get out of it.
Right.
And I really encourage parents not to use police officers for that purpose. Now, having said that, I do want to caveat it, or put a disclaimer on it, in that when there's a really dangerous situation, you have to be concerned about your safety. It's great to say all of
other children in a school.
It's great to say all of this in a perfect situation, Marlo.
Right.
But if a parent's sitting there and their kid has a knife they're pointing at them, or they're 6'3" and the parent's 5'4", and they're really threatening, or then you have to do what you have to do. I mean, then in that case, a parent has to call a police officer because that's a safety issue. Okay. Right. But if they're having a meltdown or going out of control that way, and it really is often up to the parent to have to discern which one it is. You would hope they know their kid enough to know whether the kid's dangerous or not. You have to decide in that situation, is this call for a police officer or does this call for a crisis intervention team? Now, a lot of times it's interesting. I'll get parents who called the police in because they were a little scared, but then they'll say, well, but my kid's not dangerous. He's not violent, but yet then they'll say, but then you'll say, well, then why did you call the police? Well, right. I was really scared. So it's like, you cannot have it both ways. Either you're scared or you're not. And in the moment they do have to, or like you said, or they're scared they're going to hurt another kid in the household or somebody else. But here again, we get back to this inability to regulate. Right. As I was saying in the beginning, one of the biggest problems with autism spectrum is that these individuals have never learned how to regulate their emotions. And so they go from 1 to 10, just like that. Okay. There's no in between. It's like in a second, they will escalate so that they're out of control. And then you can't bring them back down. It's like a fight or flight they get into. So that's where the work has to be done, in my opinion. A lot of that work has to be done on teaching these children how to regulate. I did it with my own kid. I know it can be done. There was a program to know how to teach them how to regulate. I don't think a lot of people know that's possible.
Well, and this gets into your curriculum. So before we end, and we are kind of coming to the end of our session, Carol, would you like to give us a little
Boy,
sneak?
that was fast.
You know, give us a little sneak peek about this curriculum you're developing, because I think it's really powerful and something that's very needed.
Yes, it's a program to teach children, teenagers, even people that have gone past 21, but mostly up to 21, or 18 to 21, giving them tools and strategies and a better way to learn how to navigate a script and an understanding. And it's pretty intensive, but it's to teach them not only to understand what to do with a police officer, around a police officer, and that's certainly an important part of it, but this is more an in-depth understanding of not going down that road. We're going to stop this from happening by getting it early so that they don't even go down that road. Okay, unknowingly go down that road, whether it be instances of crimes out in the public, like stalking, harassment, unwanted touching, and internet crimes, like internet child pornography, which is a biggie.
Well, and again, because these kids don't know that that's so bad, they don't have those same parameters around them.
And so we have to get them to know what they don't know, and to do this hands-on. That's why it has to be a hands-on way of to teach them how to do something and how not to do. Because all the ones that I work with, once they get to me, once they've already been they're in the system, I'm telling you, Marlo, most of them, the classic answer is, I didn't even know that was wrong. I didn't even know that hurt someone. I didn't even know that they were being tortured, or this or that. They just didn't know. They had no way of knowing. I didn't know that she didn't want me to touch her.
Right. And, it's interesting. Stephen Shore tells a beautiful story about, having to teach young men to walk into a men's bathroom and keep their eyes kind of on themselves, as opposed to gawking around and, like, it's not okay. You don't have to teach other young men to not gawk around and look over stalls and check out other guys who are using the urinals. But with these kids with autism, we have to teach these really, really specific skills, because they don't generalize that knowledge in the same way other kids do. And this is, I would agree with you, so often what's really lacking is not only are the kids not aware what they're needing to do, but then the adults that are interacting with them don't know what they're supposed to do either. And we have kind of this perfect storm. I want you talked about, you just mentioned it briefly, but I don't want to leave it untouched, because it's this idea of being Black and autistic. And I think it's something I'd like to spend a couple minutes on, if you don't mind. I agree with you. I think it's, whereas a little gawky looking white kid that's acting strange and swinging his grocery bag and wearing a hoodie is not going to draw the same attention. I do think we have some prejudices and biases and think that little Black kid's on drugs, whereas the little white kid is just autistic, right?
It's odd, because the case I referred to before, the 32-year-old, the police officer kept saying to him, chill out. You've been down this road before, you know the drill. And just because he was Black, I mean, that's what the conversation has been. I'm not saying it for my own. And 32 years old, this officer assumed that he had to have been in contact with police before. And I think, the conversation has been, a lot of that was because he is Black. Okay. So he assumed, like, 32 years old. So he was treating him differently. He was like, chill out and, like, stop it. You know what you're supposed to do. So in terms of talking about this issue, I think it's not a stretch to say that if you've got a person that's Black and autistic, they've got two quote stigmas or strikes against them, because people have preconceptions about autism, and they have preconceptions about being Black. I think, like you said, if a white person had been wearing that ski mask that we talked about earlier with the black,
Like
maybe they wouldn't have looked as sketchy. Maybe they would have just looked like they wanted to be warm.
It's interesting you talk about that one. And I've read that I've actually followed the Elijah McClain case very closely. And it's interesting because they really did assume that he was on drugs. I mean, but if you really listen to what he was saying, and by the way, I don't know that he was even formally diagnosed, but if you listen to the transcript, which I have done, he's talking about being a vegetarian. He's talking, yes. I mean, he's got yes. all these things going on, and they just assume that unusual talk is based on drugs. And again, that may have not even been a prejudice, but it was certainly this idea that this kid's on drugs and therefore he can tolerate this pretty high dose of ketamine that's going to calm him down, and couldn't. And it was this kind of idea that somehow it was this assumption that I've got this, young adult kid wearing a ski mask, swinging his grocery bag around. He's a black kid. He's walking around the streets at night. What is he doing out here? And now it sounds like he's talking crazy. So it must be drugs. And again, that may or may not be prejudices, but it's certainly, like you say, kind of that double strike. And I think we have to acknowledge that.
Absolutely. And I think unfortunately, we're probably going to see more of that with what's going on.
Right. Do you have any last tips or takeaways? I know you kind of said it all, but maybe if you had kind of that last thing you hope people get out of this session, if they just kind of get to the end and want to know that one takeaway, what do you think that one thing is that you think is the most important?
I guess the takeaway I would have to give, depending upon who's watching this is probably more targeted to parents or school personnel, is just, I really feel strongly, Marlo, not to get the police involved unless you have to. And that's not a strike against the police. It's right. Just that they should be used for what they're used for best.
They're trained best
what
to
they're
do.
trained for. And I say that because it really breaks my heart when I get these cases where the police were called in, and but for that, we wouldn't be dealing with this. I would just ask parents to be really discriminate in terms of when they call the police in, or right. And schools too. Getting the police to that too.
I've seen this, that it's almost like a threat. Like, if you don't do this, we're going to call the police. And then it becomes like this threat. Well, now I have to follow through on this threat. When that wasn't really a solution in the first place. It was kind of like a threat to try and get the behavior to stop.
Right. Yeah. And I'm not even sure that many of the people on the spectrum even understand, have the same reaction that someone else. If anything, it may send them into a complete meltdown.
Exactly.
Or run away, or
yeah, that's really great advice. So yeah, it was awesome talking to you, and I am really excited to hear more about your curriculum as that's getting completed. So maybe
absolutely, you'll be the first to know as I'm completing it, and as I get in, I'll reach out again if there's another part of this topic or another topic to speak on, because I really like this platform.
Well, you're always welcome. And as you know, for those of our viewers who are joining this session, we have our online conference, but we also have a watch party scheduled for September where you can watch with other people, and hopefully we can talk Carol into maybe joining us for a couple hours live during that. So thank you so much. And we're glad that everyone could be here today. And thank you again, Carol.
Good to see you again, Marlo. And this was great. Yep.
Take care.
Take care. Stay safe.
All right. Bye-bye.